The moment Iran aimed at Diego Garcia, the war stopped being about the Middle East alone, because Diego Garcia is not just another base on a map. It is a remote U.S.-U.K. fortress in the Indian Ocean, roughly 4,000 kilometers from Iran, a place designed to feel untouchable. And that is why this moment is so dangerous. Reuters, citing the Wall Street Journal and U.S. officials, reported that Iran fired 2 ballistic missiles toward the base. Neither hit. One reportedly failed in flight, and a U.S. warship launched an SM-3 interceptor at the other. But the real shock was not the damage, it was the distance. For years, Iran publicly kept insisting it had imposed a 2,000-kilometer limit on its ballistic missile range. Diego Garcia sits far beyond that line. And when a country suddenly reaches twice as far as many believed, the first casualty is not a runway or a bunker, it is certainty. That is why this strike attempt matters far beyond whether the missiles landed. Diego Garcia has long been one of the most important pieces of American power projection outside the United States. It supports operations across the Middle East, East Africa, and South Asia. It has hosted long-range bombers, surveillance platforms, pre-positioned military supplies, submarines, and the kind of logistics network that makes U.S. military reach possible. The U.K. has called it strategically critical. The U.S. State Department has called it a vital asset for regional and global security. In plain English, Diego Garcia is one of the quiet engines behind American intervention power. So when Iran reaches for that island, it is not just attacking a base, it is attacking the idea that the United States can sit far offshore, strike at will, and remain beyond retaliation. And that is where the headline gets even more explosive. Is the U.S. no longer safe? The truthful answer is more unsettling than either side's propaganda. If by the U.S. you mean the American mainland, the answer is no. Not based on what has been publicly demonstrated. Even the New York Times reported that Iran's missiles still do not put the U.S. homeland in range. This was not an intercontinental strike. It was not proof that Tehran can suddenly hit New York, Washington, or Los Angeles. But if by the U.S. you mean American bases, American troops, American warships, and the global military architecture Washington relies on, then the answer is yes. That safety buffer has been badly shaken. And that distinction matters because empires are not only defended at home, they are defended through distant outposts. Once those outposts lose their aura of invulnerability, the cost of power rises fast. To understand why Iran would choose Diego Garcia, you have to understand how Iran thinks about war. Tehran has spent decades building a strategy around asymmetry. It knows it cannot match the United States plane for plane, carrier for carrier, or dollar for dollar. So instead it built something cheaper, harder to deter, and politically more usable: missiles, drones, proxy networks, and maritime disruption. Ever since the Iran-Iraq War, the trauma of being outgunned from the air pushed Iran toward a doctrine in which missiles became both shield and sword. They compensate for an aging air force. They let Iran threaten stronger enemies without needing air superiority. And most importantly, they create doubt. They force opponents to ask not, can Iran win, but how much pain can Iran still inflict? That is a very different question, and often the more important one. For years, most of that Iranian missile logic was regional. Israel, Gulf infrastructure, U.S. bases in Iraq, the Persian Gulf, and nearby waters were all clearly within range. That was already enough to threaten energy markets and U.S. forces. But Diego Garcia changes the geometry. Suddenly, a base that sits far out in the Indian Ocean, chosen partly because of its isolation, becomes part of the battlefield. That sends 3 messages at once. First, to Washington, distance no longer guarantees sanctuary. Second, to London, if you let your territory support attacks on Iran, your flag does not shield you. And third, to every U.S. ally, if this conflict expands, the map of vulnerability expands with it. Even if the missiles missed, the strategic message landed exactly where Tehran wanted it to. But here is the twist most sensational headlines leave out. Range is not the same thing as mastery. Hitting a target 4,000 kilometers away is one thing. Hitting it accurately, reliably, and in large large numbers is another. The Reuters report said one missile failed in flight. A U.S. warship fired a defensive interceptor at the other. That tells us two things. Iran may now have access to a much longer reach than many assumed, but that reach may still be crude, experimental, or limited. AP noted that one analyst from the Royal United Services Institute suggested the strike might even have involved an improvised use of Iran's Simorgh space launch technology, trading accuracy for distance. If that is true, then Tehran may have proven concept, but not yet perfected capability. And in strategy, that still matters. Because once a state proves it can attempt the shot, the next question is how quickly it can improve it. This is why the real story is not simply military, it is psychological. Diego Garcia was supposed to be the rear area, the place behind the front line. When that rear area gets targeted, even unsuccessfully, military planners start recalculating everything: air defense coverage, ship positioning, bomber dispersal, fuel storage, supply chain routing, risk exposure for British and American personnel. And once planners recalculate, politicians feel the pressure. Because every extra interceptor, every extra warship, every extra Marine battalion deployed to protect what used to feel safe is an admission that the war is more dangerous than advertised. Distance used to save money, save lives, and buy political comfort. Iran just challenged all three. And that brings us to Donald Trump, because this missile story is not happening in a political vacuum. It is hitting at the exact moment his Iran strategy is looking increasingly contradictory. Reuters reported that Trump has said the war may be nearing its objectives and that the U.S. is considering winding down its military effort. But at nearly the same moment, AP reported his administration was sending more warships and around 2,500 additional Marines to the region. At the same time, his administration moved to temporarily relax sanctions on some Iranian oil already at sea in order to ease pressure on global energy prices. So the picture is extraordinary. Washington is bombing Iran with one hand, reinforcing the theater with another, and loosening restrictions on Iranian oil with a third. That is not the image of a clean strategy. That is the image of a White House trying to fight a war, calm markets, reassure voters, and prevent escalation all at once. And the markets are part of this story, whether Washington likes it or not. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is one of the world's most sensitive economic pressure points. Roughly 1/5 of global oil passes through it. Reuters and AP both described how Iranian attacks, maritime disruption, and retaliation around Gulf energy infrastructure have shaken prices and exposed the limits of U.S. control. Trump may say the campaign is succeeding, but if oil jumps, gas prices rise, shipping insurance spikes, and allies refuse to help police the waterway, the public sees something different. They see a war that leaks directly into household costs. That is where presidents start losing the argument. Not when maps change, but when price boards change. This is why Trump is under pressure from two directions at the same time. Hawks want proof that U.S. power still dominates the escalation ladder. They want stronger retaliation, firmer deterrence, and no sign of hesitation after Iran reached for Diego Garcia. But skeptics, including parts of Trump's own base, see the opposite danger. Reuters has reported that rising gas prices, additional troop deployments, and the lack of a clear exit strategy are threatening support for Trump and for Republicans heading into the midterms. A president who returned promising to avoid endless wars now faces the optics of a conflict that keeps widening in geography, cost, and purpose. That is politically toxic, especially when even his own stated goals keep shifting. And those shifts matter more than they seem. Reuters laid out how Trump's stated objectives have moved from toppling Iran's government to destroying its missile and naval capabilities, to preventing a nuclear weapon, to vague claims that the war is nearly complete, to suggestions it is only beginning, and then back again to talk of winding down. That kind of inconsistency is not just a messaging problem, it creates strategic confusion. If the goal is regime change, the war looks open-ended. If the goal is deterrence, Diego Garcia suggests deterrence is incomplete. If the goal is nuclear rollback, military action alone may not finish the job. And if the goal is simply to punish Iran and leave, then the question becomes brutally simple. What happens the day after the United States steps back and Iran is still standing, still armed, still angry, and now more willing to shoot farther than before? That question is exactly why Diego Garcia matters so much. It reveals that even after weeks of strikes, Iran still retains escalation tools, maybe not enough to defeat the United States militarily, but enough to complicate victory, prolong the crisis, and impose costs. Reuters reported analysts warning that the war has escalated beyond Trump's control. That phrase should stop everyone cold, because major powers almost never lose first by losing battles. They lose by losing control of the ladder of escalation. They bomb to restore deterrence, only to discover the other side can still disrupt oil, still fire missiles, still pressure allies, still fracture domestic opinion, and still force Washington to keep choosing between escalation and embarrassment. Diego Garcia is a symbol of that problem. It says, even your safe platform is now in play. And there is a deeper geopolitical consequence. U.S. power in the Middle East has always rested on three assumptions. First, overwhelming military superiority. Second, a network of bases that enables rapid action. Third, the belief among allies that America can protect them while absorbing relatively little risk itself. Iran cannot erase the first assumption. The U.S. still has vastly greater military capacity, but it can start eroding the second and third. If bases are more exposed and allies feel the conflict spreading rather than being contained, then U.S. power becomes more expensive to use and harder to trust. That does not mean American collapse. It means friction, more defenses needed, more negotiations required, more doubts whispered in allied capitals. And in geopolitics, persistent doubt can be as powerful as a single strike. Notice also what Tehran may be doing with timing. A long-range shot at Diego Garcia is not just operational, it is narrative warfare. Iran is telling its own population, its regional proxies, and its rivals that it is not cornered. Even after heavy pressure, it can still surprise. It can still redraw mental maps. It can still impose strategic headlines on the West. This matters because wars are fought twice, once on the battlefield and once in the perception of momentum. If the public in Washington, London, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, or Brussels starts to believe Iran still has unknown tools in reserve, then every future strike carries more uncertainty, and uncertainty is ammunition. At the same time, it would be a mistake to overstate what happened. A failed or intercepted strike does not make Iran a superpower. It does not prove a mature inventory of accurate 4,000-kilometer missiles. It does not mean Europe or the U.S. mainland are suddenly defenseless. In fact, the very fact that the missiles did not hit the base suggests major limitations remain. But underestimating the event would be just as foolish. Strategic history is full of warnings that arrived before capability fully matured. The first successful drone swarms, the first anti-ship missile scares, the first cyber sabotage campaigns, the first proxy attacks on major oil infrastructure. They were often dismissed as isolated incidents until they became recurring features of war. Diego Garcia may be remembered in exactly that way, not as the day the balance flipped, but as the day the old comfort died. There is also an uncomfortable British angle here. AP reported that Britain had initially resisted letting Diego Garcia be used for U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran, then later permitted its use for specific defensive operations, including strikes against sites used to attack shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister responded by accusing Prime Minister Keir Starmer of putting British lives at risk. That is not mere rhetoric. Tehran is making a classic deterrent argument. If your territory becomes a launch platform, it becomes a target. That puts London in a bind. Support Washington too fully, and British territory becomes more exposed. Hold back, and the alliance looks strained. This is exactly the kind of pressure Iran wants to create inside the Western camp. And then there is the military lesson Washington cannot ignore. For years, American planners have assumed that the biggest threats to bases come from nearby missile inventories, proxy militias, drones, sabotage, or terror attacks. Diego Garcia expands that threat envelope. It suggests the rear can become the front much faster than before. That will likely drive more emphasis on integrated air and missile defense, wider dispersal of aircraft, hardened infrastructure, redundancy in logistics, and perhaps a rethinking of how bombers and fuel depots are positioned. In other words, even a missed strike can generate real strategic costs because every protective adaptation absorbs money, time, and operational flexibility. Iran does not need a perfect hit to force those costs. It only needs a credible warning. So, is the United States no longer safe? Here is the hardest answer, and probably the most accurate one. America is not suddenly defenseless. Its homeland is not now exposed to proven Iranian intercontinental strike capability, but American power is less insulated than it was before this moment. Its remote bases are more contestable, its assumption of distance is weaker, its ability to wage a limited war without paying a wider geopolitical price looks less convincing. And for a superpower, that is a serious form of vulnerability, because the real shield of empire is not just steel. It is the belief that steel can always arrive from somewhere safer. Iran just tested the idea that maybe there is no safe enough anymore. That is why Trump's pressure is now more than political theater. He has to prove that this was a failed stunt, not a strategic turning point. He has to calm markets without looking weak. He has to reassure allies without widening the war. He has to punish Iran without giving Tehran the very regional inferno it may want. He has to explain why more troops are going in while the war is supposedly winding down. And he has to do all of that while voters watch gas prices, casualty risks, and contradictory messaging pile up. The missile aimed at Diego Garcia did not just cross distance, it crossed into the heart of his narrative. The narrative that force can be decisive, limited, and controlled. And that is the deepest reason this story matters. In modern geopolitics, the decisive blow is not always the one that destroys the target. Sometimes it is the one that exposes the illusion that remote bases are automatically secure, the illusion that a superior military can always choose the boundaries of a war, the illusion that escalation can be managed like a television script, rising on command and ending on cue. Diego Garcia was supposed to symbolize reach, safety, and control. Now it symbolizes something else, that even the strongest powers can discover in a single failed strike that the geography of fear has already moved. So no, this was not the moment Iran proved it can hit the American homeland. But it may be remembered as the moment it proved something almost as consequential, that the United States can still dominate the battlefield and yet feel less secure, less certain, and less in control than before. And once a superpower starts fighting to restore deterrence by proving it still has deterrence, the question is no longer who fired farther. The question is who forced the other side to rethink the map.